Salutations, boys and girls. It's really early in the morning, but I wanted to get started reading because I am so excited to find out what happened to Mrs. Brisbane. Now, it's so early that Harrison is still sound asleep. So I'm going to read quietly. All right. Okay. I was so worried I could hardly concentrate on our classwork that morning. Not that there was much. Mr. E started the day off by having all the students share their jokes. That was their homework. Can you believe it? My friend's jokes were pretty funny, though. Hurry Up Harry had a good one. Why does a stork stand on one leg, he asked. His answer, because if it raised both legs, it would fall down. And Rolling Rosie made everyone groan when she asked, what's brown and sticky? A stick. Phoebe forgot to bring a joke, but I know one, she said. What do you say to a crying whale? Quit your blubberin'. Now that's my favorite. Everyone seemed so happy. I began to think maybe nothing had happened at all to Mrs. Brisbane. Maybe she'd just gone on a vacation. But then I remembered her saying, see you in the morning. I've learned enough about humans to know that they don't leave on vacations without planning ahead. Especially a human like Mrs. Brisbane. Now, Humphrey's Detectionary says, clues can make you worry, worry, worry. All right, next chapter. Chapter 5, The Case of the Afternoon Accident. Here it is. So now you're probably asking yourself, yes, I can see you thinking right now, what happened in the afternoon? And who is the accident happening to? Okay, let's read to find out. When you hear the answer, thumbs up. The rest of the morning was a blur. First, Mr. E reached in his sack and pulled out a big rolled up map. He tacked it on the bulletin board and taught my friends a game called Map Attack. I couldn't really see what was going on because they stood in front of the map and blocked my view. It got very noisy, and the rest of the class seemed to have a lot of fun. Next came Animal Addition. This time, Mr. E pulled out finger puppets in different animal shapes, and the class played the game of adding and subtracting. I don't know why they needed fake animals when there were two perfectly good, real animals right in the classroom. But nobody seemed to notice, Og or me. My classmates enjoyed the game, but I thought the problems were a little easy for them, especially for Small Paul, who is a math whiz. Then, right after lunch, something really odd happened. The door opened and my friends all streamed in, talking and giggling as usual. But when they were all in their seats, I noticed that one chair was empty. Were they playing that game that they played yesterday? That Who's Missing game? I just kept squeaking loudly and loudly. Well, I guess I didn't squeak loudly enough. But luckily, Helpful Holly also noticed that Harry was missing. Excuse me, Mr. E, she said. Yes, Holly, he asked. She pointed at Harry's empty chair. Harry didn't come back from lunch. Mr. E looked at the empty chair and scratched his head. Oh, yeah, does anyone know where he is? I didn't have any idea, and neither did any of my friends. Holly's hand shot up. I'll go look for him, she said. Oh, no, I'm sure he'll turn up in a minute, Mr. E said. I don't think Mrs. Brisbane would ever say that. She'd worked so hard since the beginning of school to help Hurry Up Harry learn to be on time. Mrs. Brisbane spends a lot of time thinking up ways to help her students. Or at least she did. I spent a lot of time thinking up ways to help Mrs. Brisbane, but how can I help her if she wasn't here? Mr. E was trying to tell my friends how to play Word War when the door opened and Harry strolled in. Welcome back. Glad you can join us. Yeah, thanks. Harry said. That did it. Did Mr. E think it was fine for Harry to come to class whenever he felt like it? The game began when Mr. E wrote a word on the board. Then 2 students ran up and made a list of new words by adding letters at the beginning or the end. They started with 8 and then wrote mate and hate, then hated, late, later, and slate. Whoever came up with the most words won that round. I could tell my friends enjoyed being able to run in the classroom. They got louder and louder as they cheered each other, and the game got more and more exciting. Then Mr. E wrote another word on the board. Eat. I've got it, Slow Down Simon shouted as he raced to the board. I know. Be careful, Kelsey said as she ran up to the board. Simon didn't slow down. Kelsey forgot to be careful. Uh-oh, I bet this is where the accident comes in. The 2 of them rammed right into each other. Ow, Simon yelled, holding the side of his head. Ow, Kelsey shouted, clapping her hand over her eye. Kelsey cried a little and Simon kept saying, ow, ow, ow. How many times had Mrs. Brisbane tried to think of ways to slow down Simon? How many times had Mrs. Brisbane encouraged Kelsey to think before doing things? And now that Mrs. Brisbane was gone, look what happened. Mr. E decided to send them to the nurse's office. Oh, I could go with them, Holly volunteered. I think they can manage on their own, Mr. E told her. That was the end of word war. Thank goodness. What's next? Mr. E said. Helpful Holly raised her hand. It's time to look after Humphrey and Og, she said. Oh, right, said Mr. E. Then Holly said, Humphrey needs his veggies. Did anyone bring veggies for the hamster? Mr. E asked. The hamster, as if I didn't even have a name. Oh no, Phoebe exclaimed. I forgot. Sorry, Humphrey. I might have felt discouraged, except for the fact that 6 hands went up in the air. A lot of my friends had remembered to bring me a treat. Just Joey offered a piece of lettuce. Tall Paul brought a blueberry. Small Paul brought sunflower seeds, my personal favorite. Rolling Rosie had some yummy celery, and Holly offered a tiny bit of broccoli. Thomas gave me his carrot sticks again, which isn't really a good thing because he really should be eating his own carrot sticks. There were so many hamster-licious things to eat. I hid some of them in my cheek pouch and the rest in my bedding. It's always nice to save a little something for the future. I was still busily nibbling when Simon and Kelsey came back. Simon was holding an ice pack on the side of his head. Kelsey was holding an ice pack on her eye. Everything all right now? Mr. E asked. They both nodded and took their seats. I think it's story time, Mr. E said. Whew, my ears twitched when he said that. Was he finally going to read the rest of that Sherlock Holmes story from that big red book? My friends were on the edges of their chairs as well. Mr. E reached in his sack and pulled out a piece of paper, which didn't look anything like a book. Let's write our own silly stories, he said. Oh, I sighed. Was I ever going to hear the rest of the Red-Headed League and learn how a real detective works? Mr. E then asked the class to supply different words, nouns, verbs, words that describe things. Oh, I didn't know there were so many different words. He wrote each of them on a piece of paper. Then he made up a silly story using all of those words. The story made no sense at all, but my friends liked it. The door suddenly burst open, and standing there was Mrs. Wright. Her fingers were on her whistle, which made me nervous. But luckily she didn't blow it. In one hand, Mrs. Wright held a clipboard. It's Mrs. Wright, Mr. E said, right? Mr. Endopoulos, Mrs. Wright said. I'm co-chairman of the School Safety Committee. I understand there's been inquiries in this classroom. Oh, that didn't make sense. I understand there have been injuries in this classroom. Just a little accidents. Kids will be kids. Mrs. Wright shoved the clipboard toward him. You will have to fill out an accident report. Their parents will be notified. It was just an accident, Mr. E said. There were injuries on school property, she said. A report must be filed. Mrs. Wright took a few more steps into the classroom and looked around. I also had a report of a student wandering the halls after the lunch bell rang. Was that one of yours? She asked. I don't know. What was it? The hallway should be empty after the bell rings, Mrs. Wright said. I've put a copy of the rules under the accident report. She fingered that silver whistle around her neck. The report is due in the morning. I was really worried that she was about to blow the whistle. Instead, she turned and walked out the door. Whew, I was glad to see her go, but I was also glad to see that someone was concerned about my classmates besides Og and me. All right, we'll stop there. Well, now we know what the accident was, and I wonder if this classroom is ever going to get back to normal.